Now, to return to more political history, we had this question, right? How does Chiang Kai-shek respond to the Manchurian incident, right? How is he going to respond to that, right? Think about this. Chiang Kai-shek is in charge of this central government, which has unified much of China, but not all of it. And a very important piece of the Republic of China has now been seized. And it's clear to everyone that even though there's this so-called Manchukuo headed by the Manchu Emperor Puyi, it's clear that this is a puppet state controlled by the Japanese. So what's Chiang Kai-shek going to do? The major thing he does is he protests at the League of Nations, right? This kind of thing similar to the UN, but not as strong. He protests. The League of Nations is going to find in China's favor, but it doesn't really have any teeth. And so Japan will just withdraw from the League of Nations and nothing can be done. And instead of fighting the Japanese, he's going to withdraw in the face of Japanese pressure. Now, this is complex. I don't want to go too much into it, but usually the 2 years that are given in terms of Japan's aggression against China, 1931 is the first year when Manchuria is attacked, and then 1937 when there's a war, when Japan invades, basically. And then the Chinese fight back really hard. But in that few years between 1931 and 1937, the Japanese actually continue to expand their power into northern China. And as they do that, Chiang Kai-shek will not fight them. He will withdraw. Now, one thing I should point out, a lot of the people who controlled northern China were warlords. It wasn't just Chiang who controlled that. Remember, he's not able to get rid of all the warlords. But in any case, Chiang Kai-shek and these warlords are going to withdraw in the face of Japanese pressure. Chiang will instead concentrate on fighting the communists. Right, so Chiang is facing the Japanese trying to take part of his country, and his solution is to concentrate on fighting other Chinese, fighting the communists, right? And one thing you have to remember about Chiang Kai-shek's position is he has to deal with both a foreign invasion and a civil war at the same time. So Chiang, you may say, this is crazy. Why would you do this? Why not fight the Japanese? Chiang's view was that if he fought the Japanese, he would lose. He said China is not ready to fight the Japanese. Their armies are too advanced. Our country is not unified enough. We need to unify first and develop our economy, develop our army. Then we can fight the Japanese. Because if we fight the Japanese, we will lose. All right, we're just going to flat out going to lose. But if we defeat the communists first, that will make us stronger, and then we can eventually defeat the Japanese. That's his strategy. It actually makes sense. And traditionally, this is how things work. You need to get unity at home before you can deal with foreigners abroad. Otherwise, you're going to lose. And we'll see that what happens is Chiang is forced to fight the Japanese later, and what he predicts happens, basically. And it's interesting that Chiang Kai-shek will say the Japanese are a disease of the skin, while the communists are a disease of the heart. We have to deal with the heart disease first, not the skin disease. Now, the Chinese public is really frustrated about this. They don't understand why, when the Japanese are invading, you would spend your efforts fighting other Chinese people. They would say, we Chinese people need to unify to fight against the Japanese. That's very logical if you're in the Chinese public. What the Chinese public doesn't realize is just how different visions of China Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong and the communists have, right? They have very different understandings of what China should become. But in this case, for now, the Chinese public are nationalistic, they're patriotic, and they don't understand why you would fight and kill other Chinese instead of fighting the foreigners who are taking over your country. So Chiang Kai-shek is going to be spending his efforts to destroy communism in the 1930s, right? So even as Japan, as I said, is invading, is taking over Manchuria and expanding in northern China, Chiang is going to focus on attacking the communists. He's successful in pushing the communists out of the cities. He will attempt to destroy the communists in the countryside. This doesn't go as well. It's hard to do that, but he eventually drives them out of their main base in central China. And this leads to what's called the Long March, when the Chinese communists go on this very, very long, several thousand-mile march through China in order to survive and escape from Chiang's forces. And they then are able to escape and establish a new base. But if he would have just been able to keep concentrating on them, he maybe would have won. He probably could eventually have defeated them. But the communists are going to survive. And there's multiple reasons for that. First of all is their organization. The communists are just really well organized and really well disciplined. And that gives them, that kind of unity really helps them. So for example, when Chiang Kai-shek was trying to capture the communists, he often had to use warlord troops who didn't care about Chiang and were like, the communists are making Chiang weaker, so let's just let the communists do what they want. And there were times when warlord troops could have stopped the communists, but they let them pass peacefully through their territory. And they said, the communists are fine. They're giving Chiang Kai-shek a hard time. That's great. If he's concentrating on the communists, we warlords can do what we want. Remember, Chiang Kai-shek did not defeat all the warlords, especially in the West and in the North. You can see the communists are moving through the West, where the warlords do still have some strength. And so, Chiang Kai-shek has a divided government. The communists, on the other hand, are united. They're organized. They're able to keep it together and keep going. The communists are also motivated by a very strong ideal of building a communist utopia. Remember, we talked about that. It's a very attractive idea. Let's have a world where we can all be free from oppression, where we can enjoy our work, and everyone will get enough stuff and enough time and the freedom to enjoy it. That was a major thing that made communists willing to commit. And the inequalities, the suffering, the injustices in Chinese society continued. So as long as those continued, people were willing to believe in the ideology because it offered a hope for them. The final reason I want to mention, though, is Mao Zedong. Right? Mao Zedong was, he's a man that, as I will talk about later, I despise in many ways. But I have to say, he was a genius. He was an amazing man in terms of his genius. He just was, in many ways, a very bad man and will kill millions of people, basically. But the guy was a genius. So who was this Mao Zedong guy? Well, he was born into a prosperous peasant family. So he was born into a family of farmers, but ones that were doing well and well enough that they could send him to school. Right? So he got formal schooling, he got some modern schooling, and he was a very intelligent, very curious person. So he became a voracious reader. He read like everything he could. He was constantly reading. And what's really cool is he got a job as a librarian. And one thing about, and I think this is fascinating, this is one thing about working in a library. Librarians do work hard, but especially if you're at the front desk, you have time sometimes because there's no one who needs help. So you'll sit at the front desk waiting for someone to show up. So you need something to do. Well, in your library, what do? You read. So he spent a lot of time in the library working, but then there weren't people who were there to need help. So he would read. And he was in a very, he was working at a university library that had like the most recent information. So he was learning about communism and all these different ideas. So you got this smart guy who has good schooling, who's curious, who's learning about everything. And he's going to become convinced that China needs to undergo a revolution. Right? Remember the the May 4th movement that's occurring starting like 1915 to 1925, and especially reaches its head or its major start in 1919 after the Versailles Treaty. Notice Mao's age. That's that time period is when everything's like new. We want new things, and New Youth is the big journal. And he's in his early 20s and late teens during that time period. That's what they mean by youth. Right? They don't mean like 5 and 6 year olds. They mean like people in their late teens, 20s, even to their early 30s. And he will become convinced to be a revolutionary. Right? He'll become convinced that there needs to be a revolution, that China needs to undergo a thoroughgoing revolution like the May 4th movement was calling for. What's also interesting is that he was a poet. Right? And he was a really good poet. And the thing about Chinese poetry is it can be very difficult, but it can also express a lot of very deep ideas in just very few words. And that's ideal if you want to communicate your ideas, especially to people like peasants. So Mao Zedong was this interesting guy because he could, very smart, very well read, but also, and the problem when you're very smart and very well read and well educated, that can cut you off from the population, from the people, right? How does a well-educated person talk to peasants? How can they understand each other? It sounds odd, but as a poet who was used to saying a lot in very few words, he was able to communicate very well. And here's the other thing that I think is amazing about the guy. He was a really good administrator, right? Revolutionaries tend to be people we think of who do not like rules, who don't like laws, who want to bring massive change. And so they tend not to be very disciplined, right? And we don't think of poets either as being people who are very well disciplined and very well organized typically. Maybe that's, and I think that's maybe a prejudice against poets, but that's the stereotype. But he was also, despite all that, was a great administrator. He was great at organizing people and keeping track of facts and gathering data and all that stuff. So you put these things together, right? You've got this guy who's willing to just change everything, who has the brains to figure out what should be done, and who's able to communicate that and evoke people's emotions and like get them to be convinced that this idea is a good one and they should follow him. And when you put all this stuff together, he becomes not only an early member of the Communist Party, he becomes one of its leaders. And the thing is, the Soviet Union gave a lot of financial support to the Chinese Communist Party, but a lot of bad advice. Right? The Soviet Union is going to give a lot of financial support, but terrible advice. For example, they wanted China to have a city-based communist revolution. They were constantly telling the Chinese, oh, you need to organize the cities. You need to organize the cities. Why? Because that's how communism happened in the Soviet Union. Right? When you had the communist revolution in Russia, it was led by workers following the vanguard party of Lenin. And it took power in the cities, and then it went out and took over the rest of the country. So they thought the Chinese had to do the same thing. But Mao said, this is madness. We're mostly a place in the countryside. And Mao argued that peasants then would bring the revolution. He said, we need to get out of the cities. We need to go to the countryside. And I know how to talk to these peasants. I understand them. I understand the problems they face. I can convince them to rise up and help us build a new China. And he was totally correct. He was totally right. And you may recall earlier I said in communism, there's this idea that you have to go through these stages. You have to go through feudalism, and then you have to go through capitalism. Then you can only have communism. Mao was like, we don't need to go into capitalism so much. We're in feudalism, and people say the peasants in feudalism aren't a revolutionary force. I will make them a revolutionary force. Right? The peasants just need leadership. They just need organization. Right? So he's going to turn that on its head. He's going to show that the previous communist doctrine was off, that peasants can bring a revolution. And remember, I talked about Chiang Kai-shek. I said one of his strengths was he did have a support base, right? The middle classes, the business classes, the landlords supported him, but they're not the important class. The important class in China are the peasants. They're the vast majority of the population. If you can organize them and lead them, you will win. Mao figures that out, and Mao pulls it off. But the thing is, even Mao, with all his genius, probably would not have been able to pull this off if Japan had not expanded. Right? If Japan had not continued to expand. Now, here's the thing, and this is really bizarre, so please bear with me for a moment. There was mounting frustration with Chiang's strategy. Many Chinese people did not understand why they were fighting other Chinese people, the communists, when the Japanese were going on to expand. Chiang believed, though, that they had to wait, right? They wanted to make China strong. Part of that was defeating the communists. Then you could fight Japan. Now, Japan eventually gets to the point that Chiang Kai-shek says, we're going to fight back now. We're strong enough, and Japan has just gone too far. Japanese expansion, they just won't stop. They keep coming and coming and coming. And so Chiang actually prepares to fight back. And just as he's preparing to fight back against the Japanese, a warlord actually will kidnap him in the city of Xi'an in northern China in 1936 and will not release him until he agrees to form an alliance with the communists to fight Japan. This is called the Second United Front. The First United Front was during the Northern Expedition that we talked about previously, in which in which the nationalists and the communists worked together, and it didn't last very long because, they hated each other and had very different visions of what China should be. And remember, Chiang ended it with the Shanghai massacres and the White Terror. Well, now Chiang, just as he's getting ready to actually fight the Japanese, is kidnapped by a warlord who says, I'm not going to let you go until you agree to work with the communists because we need to be fighting Japanese soldiers, not Chinese soldiers. And Chiang is like, well, that's what I was getting ready to do. But in any case, Chiang now will form the Second United Front under this pressure, and now the nationalists and communists will be working together to fight the Japanese. They totally don't really work together. In fact, they actually start to fight each other some. But the key thing is now Chiang has to fight the Japanese. And what's really ironic is the Japanese, who were extraordinarily anti-communist, are going to save Chinese communism. Right? If Chiang Kai-shek would have been able to been allowed to continue fighting the communists, even though Mao was a genius, he probably would have lost. He just wouldn't have had the time and the resources. But now Chiang has to turn around and fight the Japanese. And so Japan will accidentally save communism. So basically what happens is this. In 1937, in an area in northern China called the Marco Polo Bridge, because there's an actual bridge there, there were Japanese and Chinese units facing each other, and a Japanese soldier disappeared. Right, Japanese soldier disappeared, and the Japanese claimed that the Chinese must have kidnapped him, and they demanded the right to go over and inspect the Chinese areas. And the Chinese said, "No way, we're going to let you do that. This is our territory. You can't just come in here. If you want us to look for the guy, we will, but you're not coming here." And this leads to fighting. Eventually, they'll start shooting at each other. And what it turns out, actually, as an aside, the Japanese soldier who disappeared, had probably just wandered off to go to the bathroom and got lost. So it's really this bizarre situation because no one really was thinking of having a war at this time. But usually in the past when this happened, the Japanese would push to fight the Chinese because they knew if they had an excuse, they could fight the Chinese and they could get more concessions out of the Chinese. But now Chiang Kai-shek is convinced we're going to fight back. And the Japanese military, instead of saying, "Oh, geez, the Chinese are willing to fight back now, maybe we need to be more careful," instead the Japanese military say, "You know what? We're going to win a war. We're going to fight the Chinese. It's just going to be like that war back in 1894-95 where we just easily defeated the Chinese. We'll beat them up, and that will allow us to settle all the outstanding issues between Japan and China, right? We're going to really now have a big war, but it's going to be a quick war. It's going to be a massive victory for Japan because these Chinese are pushovers. We all know it, so we'll easily defeat them. And in particular, what we want is we want Manchuria to be recognized as an independent country, and we want China to basically become a semi-colony so we can get access to its resources, right? That's what the military wants to do, and that's what they think they can do. They're wrong. They cannot do this, and they're deeply wrong about China. China is a new China. Anyone who spent any time in China by this time would and was open-minded would realize this, but the Japanese military just saw what they wanted to see. And so what's going to happen is essentially the Japanese are going to attack, thinking they're going to enter into a short war that will allow them to settle these outstanding issues, to get control of Manchuria and even more resources from China by reducing China to a semi-colony. And they're not going to allow the diplomats or anyone else essentially in Tokyo to act, and that's going to utterly prevent any kind of diplomatic solution. Right? Remember, the military's in charge in Japan. There's a saying: if the only tool in your toolbox is a hammer, all your problems look like nails, right? If your only tool in the toolbox is a hammer, all your problems look like nails. And so the Japanese military is just going to try and solve everything through military means. They're not going to leave any room for a diplomatic solution. Now, the initial fighting occurs in northern China. That's where the Japanese soldiers and the Chinese soldiers are facing each other. But the really important place that Japan is going to invade at first is Shanghai. And if you look at this map, you can see the arrow pointing to Shanghai. Shanghai is, in a sense, the commercial and cultural center in terms of new culture, modern culture of China, right? So it's kind of economic and modern center of China during this time period. And the Japanese are going to attack it. They're going to invade it. And Chiang Kai-shek decides that he's going to make a stand at Shanghai. And it turns out that Chiang is going to be basically right, in a sense, about his concern about fighting the Japanese. Chiang Kai-shek will use his best troops in Shanghai. They will fight with extraordinarily bravery and courage. They will inflict a good number of casualties on the Japanese. The Japanese are actually very frustrated by them because they're like, "Oh, these Chinese are supposed to be pushover. Why are these Chinese fighting so well?" But ultimately, those soldiers of Chiang's, his best soldiers, are ultimately defeated, and they take very, very heavy losses. So it turns out Chiang Kai-shek was in many ways completely correct about this issue of the power, or about the power of the Japanese military, and that if he would have tried to fight against them, his army would be destroyed. So Chiang tries to hold at Shanghai. His soldiers do very well, but ultimately are defeated. And just to kind of give you a sense of the destruction, on the right, you can see Japanese soldiers have torn down a statue of Sun Yat-sen, right, the founder of the Nationalist Party and the predecessor of Chiang Kai-shek. On the left, you can see a very famous picture taken of a Chinese child crying amidst rubble. This reminds us of the fact that the Japanese did bomb civilian targets in the Battle of Shanghai. They also would use poison gas against the Chinese defenders, and you can see lots of images of Chinese wearing gas masks to deal with that. So this is a victory for the Japanese, a very hard-fought victory, not an easy one, but the Chinese are ultimately defeated in the Battle of Shanghai. Chiang loses his best troops, and now the Chinese have lost, in a sense, this economic and modern cultural capital of China. So the Japanese will now advance, having taken to Shanghai, to the city of Nanjing. It's labeled as Nanking on this map, and you can see the arrow pointing to it. That is the political capital of China, right? That's where the government of China is now centered, right? It's not in Beijing anymore. It's been moved down to Nanjing, right? And that happened before the war. So the Japanese will now advance on China's political capital. The Battle of Nanjing, also sometimes called the Rape of Nanjing, does not go well. The Chinese military receives contradictory orders. There's a breakdown in communications among the soldiers. So there's the defense is not well coordinated, does not go well, and the Japanese take the city. The reason this is called the Rape of Nanjing is because what happens is after the Japanese take the city, they not only kill a large number of civilians, the estimates are something like over 200,000 civilians will be killed by the Japanese. These are Chinese civilians. There will be tens of thousands of rapes of women committed by Japanese soldiers. And there's some people in Japan who deny this. I should stress that we don't only have Chinese sources, and the Japanese would just say, well, the Chinese are just making stuff up or exaggerating. Because Nanjing was the political capital, there were like Western embassies there. There was Red Cross there. There were foreign missionaries there, all of whom provide copious evidence that the Chinese were being slaughtered and massacred and raped in large numbers by the Japanese soldiers. And this is a very, I think, disturbing thing to think about or to talk about, but this is, in fact, what did occur. And it's remembered in China today, and there's monuments kind of remembering this. And one thing I just have to emphasize, just to understand this, is you can, this sometimes happens when you take a city. And I'm not saying that's right. It's wrong. It's really terrible. But what happens is, you've got soldiers trying to take a city. They take the city, discipline breaks down, and they take out their frustration, their anger on the poor civilians living in the city. And sometimes this can go on for several days before discipline can be restored. But the Rape of Nanjing went on for weeks. It actually went on for over a month. So this massacre of Chinese civilians, this rape of Chinese women went on for a very long time. And when an army, when officers allow that to happen, that means this isn't a case of a military just having a momentary breakdown of discipline. This is strategy. This is planned, right? Like I said, sometimes an army will lose discipline. This will go on for maybe a couple days before discipline can be restored. But in this case, this just kept going and going and going. That meant the officers were supportive of it. We'll talk about why momentarily. Now, before I talk about the significance of that choice to allow this brutality to continue, meaning that the Japanese military supported it, we need to talk a little bit about this issue. I mean, didn't the Japanese see themselves as liberators? Weren't they coming in to help China and build this pan-Asian unity? And we have a fundamental problem here, right? You would think people who believe that they're trying to liberate China wouldn't massacre and rape Chinese people. So how do we explain this? And this is kind of exploring that tension I talked about earlier, that conflict about Japanese identity and Japanese goals. So we need to look a little bit what I'm going to call the Japanese militarist ideology. First of all, the Japanese militarist ideology, which is dominant in Japan at this point, is this kind of what I would call radical Shinto ultranationalism. Right? Nationalism can be just this idea, I'm Korean. I think Korea should be an independent nation state. I'm proud of our Korean culture. But, other people, they should also be proud of who they are. And they should have their own countries too. And oftentimes we would call that patriotism, right? And as an American, for example, as a patriotic American, someone who loves my country, I can respect a French person being patriotic or a Chinese person being patriotic or whoever being patriotic. But in Shinto ultranationalism, there's this idea that our country's the best and no one else is even close to us. And one reason we're the best is because we have this God emperor, right? Remember, Shinto is this indigenous Japanese religion, which holds that the emperor is a descendant of Amaterasu, the sun goddess. So we're a special place, and we're just better than other places. We're especially better than the West, because in the West, logical, traditional reason, religion, they had all brought conflict. But we, Japanese, are special because within the emperor, we have harmony, we have oneness. And this is possible because we Japanese are a naturally pure and virtuous race. It's not like we even have to try. We're just naturally pure and virtuous. And we have a special place with a special mission. We, in fact, are a special people with a divine mission to share how awesome we are with the world, especially with the Asians who we've come to liberate. And this is something the Emperor Hirohito was quite fine with. Right? The emperor was quite fine with this because, of course, it all focused on him and said how awesome he was and how special he was. So you have this difficulty, right? There's this idea, Asia for the Asians, liberate Asia from Western imperialism. But these other Asians are second-class Asians. We Japanese are the best Asians, and we're going to fix everything. And these other Asians then are kind of beneath us, right? They're better than the Westerners, but they need to know their place, and they need to accept that their place is beneath us, right? Japan is special, Japan is awesome, so it should be the leader of Asia. And that creates this very, very complex kind of relationship where Japanese can see themselves as liberators, right? There's a lot of Japanese who actually see themselves, because they had the special mission of liberating Asia, to be liberators. And you can see in this image, these are Japanese soldiers who are attacking invading China to defeat Chinese communists, who are really the ones who are behind all the atrocities, all the violence. And in fact, they are devils, right? They have a human face, but actually they're devils, right? So you see this Japanese understanding of themselves as liberators. And here, again, you can see where they have this interesting thing. And the characters on the left say hell. And that's the area of China ruled by the nationalists. And you can see the nationalists are like killing people and robbing people. And they've like stabbed this woman and are going to steal her baby. And on the right, it says heaven. And that's where the Japanese are there defending the Japanese and Manchurian people. And so you've got this belief that the Japanese have that they are actually working to protect China, to liberate China, and so forth. And if you're Chinese and you're resisting that, you're bad and you're wrong, and we need to get rid of you so that we can take over and do our job. Right? These Chinese, we're here to liberate them, and they're just not happy with liberation. They don't have the right kind of gratitude. They should be working with us, not against us, so we can save them from the West. Of course, if you're Chinese, you look and you say, the West isn't that much of a threat right now. You Japanese are, because we want to be independent. We don't want to be part of this Pan-Asian movement led by you. We want to form our own independent country. Thank you very much. So in a fundamental sense, the Japanese had this idea, we're here to protect you, Chinese, and darn it, you just aren't thankful enough for it. You're not helping us to do it. So we're going to have to punish you. We're going to have to brutalize you until you get with the program. And I just want to include this image because this really gives us a sense of almost how innocent this racism could be, if that makes sense. Because this, and what I mean by innocent is this is aimed at children. And when you look at it first, it looks like a harmless children's comic. This is called Black Stray, and it's about like this orphan puppy that joins the army, and it's an army made up of animals. And you can see the Black Stray, this orphan puppy, leading its fellow soldiers on to victory. And in one sense, if you just focus on that top panel, the message is actually kind of nice, right? Because it's this guy who's an outcast, right? He was an orphan. He didn't belong to a group, finding meaning in life with these other people and being accepted by other people. That sounds great at first. But if you look at the bottom, who are they fighting? It's pigs. They're fighting pigs. And the pigs represent the Chinese. So there's this kind of low-level background racism as well, right? It's not just over it, we think Chinese people are beneath us. They're maybe not even going to say it directly. But indirectly, the message here is the Chinese are kind of second class. Right? They're pigs, we're dogs, right? That's a stronger animal. So the key thing here is we've got this curious situation where the Japanese at the same time as seeing themselves as liberating China, are going to see the Chinese as these people who are just behind the times, who won't get with the program, who don't accept their place, and they need to be dealt with. Right? They need to be dealt with violently to convince them to get with the program so that the Asians can unite against the West. And the Japanese just will not see the Chinese perspective. That they do not see this as liberation. They were starting to build their own strong independent country. They would like to continue that. So here's the thing. Japan will succeed in conquering the political capital of China, Nanjing, as well as the economic and modern cultural capital of Shanghai. But China does not surrender. China does not surrender. In the first Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895, they did surrender at this point. Actually, didn't even get to this. As soon as the Japanese army threatened the Chinese capital in that war, the 1894 to 1895 war, the Chinese gave up and came to terms. So Japan figured, and this is why the army thought they'd have a quick victory, they figured once we take these two cities, once we take the political capital and the cultural and economic capital, the Chinese will totally give up. What they failed to recognize was that this was the new China. The new China does not surrender. This is a China that has undergone the May 4th movement. It's undergone some unification under Chiang Kai-shek. It is not going to surrender. They simply move their capital. They're going to move their capital from Nanjing to Chongqing. And if you look at that map there, you can see Chongqing is far to the west in China, very hard to reach. And from there, Chiang Kai-shek will continue to fight the Japanese. The Japanese will respond by trying to bomb Chongqing, and this includes purposely targeting civilian areas. Now, one thing I need to emphasize this for a couple of reasons. The first is just the brutality, right? Japan, in the name of liberating China, is going to bomb Chinese cities in hopes of convincing the Chinese to give up. So they will purposely target civilians. The other thing is a little bit more broad, but one thing I just want to point out, this isn't anti-Japanese. And I want to stress, I don't think that the bombing of Japanese cities by the Americans was appropriate because we killed so many civilians. But I'm kind of frustrated when the Japanese focus on the American bombing of Japan without recognizing that they bombed China first. So it's kind of hard to complain too much when your cities are bombed when you bomb someone else's cities first, right? Just as an aside, I wanted to point that out. For our purposes here, the key point is, rather than Japan saying, well, the Chinese are different, they're still fighting, we need to find a diplomatic solution, the answer, because the military was in charge, was let's use more force, let's use more violence, let's try and beat up these Chinese more. And we're going to do that by bombing their capital and killing large numbers of Chinese civilians. Japan will also establish a secret organization called Unit 731. Unit 731, I don't want to talk a lot about because it's really, really depressing, and I don't need to go into too much detail to make my point. But Unit 731 was a biological and chemical weapon facility. So this was a facility designed to develop biological and chemical weapons. They did things like develop strains of the bubonic plague, which is a very, you may have known it as the Black Death. And they would get fleas infected with that and put them on rats and then release the rats around villages so Chinese people would get the bubonic plague. One experiment they did, because they would do these medical experiments, was they would have a bomb and then they would tie up people around the bomb at varying distances from the bomb, and they would set up the bomb, and they would figure out from setting off that bomb like what the lethal range was and like how much it injured people who weren't killed. And they did this basically by kidnapping Chinese people from the cities. And by the way, they also did this to some American POWs as well, as an aside, once America was in the war. But this is trying to use this brutality, using biological and chemical weapons against the Chinese in order to liberate China and to expand Japan's empire. And like I said, I mean, they're just literally kidnapping Chinese people and forcing them to undergo medical experiments, which basically 100% of the time end ultimately in their deaths. Now, here's the thing that happens, though, in the China War. The Japanese military had promised a quick victory, And they were looking for a decisive battle when they could just absolutely devastate the Chinese, destroy their military forces, and then China would be forced to give up. And that makes sense from Japan's perspective because, frankly speaking, they just had a better army than the Chinese did. They had a more well-trained, more disciplined, and better equipped army. So that's what Japan wanted. But China is definitely not going to give that to them. Why would they? They know that they would lose. So the communists are going to mostly use guerrilla tactics, so they will harass and attack the Japanese only when they're sure they can win. Other than that, they won't fight them. The nationalists will do what's called trading space for time. That's why they retreat to Chongqing. The nationalists, when they face too much Chinese or Japanese pressure, will just withdraw because there's not that many Japanese soldiers and China is huge. So whenever the Japanese become strong in one place, the nationalists or the communists will just withdraw from there if they can and attack the Japanese somewhere where they're weaker. So the nationalists will follow the strategy of trading space for time, pulling back, avoid giving Japanese a decisive battle, forcing the Japanese to fight a long war. Now, one effect this has, I just give you this number to give you an idea of the suffering of the Chinese people. More than 25% of Chinese people will become refugees because of the Japanese attacks and because of the strategy of pulling back, right? This is tremendous. Think about this. 1 out of every 4 Chinese people has to leave their home because of the war, right? So this is a traumatic experience that many people feel. By 1939, Japan will occupy 1/3 of China in terms of territory, control 40% of its agriculture, 92% of its modern industry, and more than 80% of its tax revenues, meaning that Japan controls the most valuable, most important parts of China. And the Chinese still will not give up. They will not give the Japanese this decisive battle. So here's what's going to happen. The Japanese, and this is how we can explain all this cruelty, is they're attempting to use brutality to break the Chinese. Even as early as 1937, these Chinese, they don't know what we're here to do. They don't know we're here to liberate them. They're foolishly, stupidly, stubbornly trying to resist us. Well, we'll show them. And that's why they're willing to bomb civilians. That's why they're willing to use chemical and poison gas. That's why the military is willing to allow the rape of Nanjing. That's why they're willing to bomb Chongqing. That's why they're willing to use Unit 731 and all these attacks against Chinese civilians, even by just individual foot soldiers. It's an attempt to break the Chinese through brutality, right? It's the attempt to break the Chinese through brutality, to make this war so terrible that the Chinese will give up. So we have a deadlock here. The Chinese cannot drive out the Japanese. They're not able to kick the Japanese out of China, but the Japanese cannot destroy resistance. In fact, the brutality actually backfires. Rather than making the Chinese give in, it makes them fight back harder. The Chinese say, how could we ever live under Japanese occupation? How could we ever deal with these people? They're terrible. They're barbarians. They're killing us left and right. And you've got this image on the right is a kind of drawn by a Chinese artist in this time period, representing how the Chinese are seeing the Japanese. And it's a very visceral image of this poor woman just trying to feed her child, right? She's breastfeeding her baby, and she's killed by bombs. Now, of course, Japanese bombs weren't that small. This is taking some kind of license. But the key point is Japanese bombs are killing mothers, and you've got orphans now. And how can we accept these people? How can we make any deal with people? How can we have any negotiations with people willing to use this kind of brutality? And this is a lesson in warfare, by the way, that a lot of times brutality can backfire, right? Rather than making the Chinese want to submit, this convinces the Chinese, we got to stick together. We got to fight back and try and stop these Japanese from continuing to take over our country, because it's unthinkable of what life will be like for us if the Japanese win. So we've got a stalemate now. The Japanese cannot break the Chinese through their brutality. The Chinese will not give up, but they can't kick the Japanese out of China. So I now want to turn to some analysis to kind of think about what has happened. These are quotes from that book, The Wars for Asia, by Dr. Payne that I referred to earlier. But she kind of explains the problem with military rule and what it leads to in China and how this leads to World War II. She writes, Japanese conquest became a function of both operational success and strategic failure. The Japanese took territories because they could, but the more they took and the harder they fought, the more militarily and financially overextended they became, right? You can go in and conquer a territory, but beating an army and governing a territory are different things. There's just not enough Japanese people to govern all of China. Japanese leaders never seemed to ask the question, how much territory could Japan take before the garrisoning costs exceeded the value of the resources that could be extracted? The answer to this question was probably Manchuria. In other words, Japan, practically speaking, not morally speaking, should have just stopped at Manchuria, right? They could not hold more territory and profit from it, right? This is all they can hold on to. But because the Japanese leaders, military leaders who are in charge, they see all their problems as military and all their solutions as military, they're going to take territory that actually hurts them because they can't afford to administer and garrison that territory. And Dr. Payne continues, Japanese leaders focused on the operational level of war, winning the battles. They did not adequately consider the strategic effects of these military operations. Victory at the strategic level required stability in China, its economic integration with Japan, the elimination of communism and Soviet influence in China, trade with the West, and the end to foreign influence with Japan's plans for China. Japanese military operations did not further these strategic goals. Quite remarkably, Japanese military operations precluded their achievement. What does this mean? The military leaders only thought about winning battles, but they didn't think of an overall plan of winning the war. In order to win the war, they needed stability in China, they needed to economically integrate it with Japan, they needed to get rid of communism, and they needed to trade with the West. Now, here, the thing is this. Brutalizing Chinese people, the rape of Nanjing, Unit 731, bombing Chongqing, that does not encourage stability. It also does not encourage economic integration. And remember, the Japanese invasion prevented Chiang Kai-shek from destroying communism and thus Soviet influence. And what will happen is we'll see eventually Japan's actions in China will cause the United States to stop trading with Japan. In particular, we will not sell oil to Japan. I shouldn't say stop trading. We don't stop trading completely. But we stop selling oil to Japan and other resources that they need to fight. So in other words, everything that Japan did militarily, even though theoretically was supposed to help them win battles, and they won a lot of battles, did not actually help them win the war. It actually hurt their possibilities of winning the war.